This is Everybody Pulls the Tarp with your host, Andrew Moses. Each week, Andrew talks with Olympians, pro athletes, TV stars, Grammy winners, best-selling authors, CEOs, and other high performers to uncover their success secrets.
My guest is Washington Commanders running back Austin Ekeler.
Every day we write a page of our life. The best thing is you have the pen in your hand.
Three-time Olympic gold medalist Tessa Virtue. Welcome back to Everybody Pulls the Tarp.
Thanks for thinking of me, and I'm a big fan of the podcast and of yours. So anytime you text or call, I'm here.
Mike Mills from REM.
The key to that was realizing at some point fairly early on that this was probably our life's work.
Every conversation is jam-packed with inspiration and actionable ideas.
My guest is 2023 WNBA Coach of the Year, Stephanie White.
The hardest thing for a coach is trying to prioritize how much time you put in one area or another.
Former MLB player, coach, and manager Clint Hurdle.
That is the best title of any podcast out there in America, and the content matches up to it. Andrew, you do a fantastic job. I'm a big fan. Keep up the great work.
World-renowned organizing expert Shira Gill.
You can improve your life simply by removing things.
Get ready for a behind-the-scenes look at the techniques, processes, and mindsets powering the world's most successful people.
Let's go. Hi, friends, and welcome back to Everybody Pulls the Tarp. This week, my guest is New York Times bestselling author Margaret George. Margaret writes biographical novels about iconic historical figures. Over the years, her subjects have included Henry VIII, Cleopatra, Helen of Troy, and more. All 6 of her novels have been New York Times bestsellers, and her work on Cleopatra was made into an Emmy-nominated ABC TV miniseries. As you will hear in our conversation, Margaret began traveling the world at the age of 4, when her father joined the U.S. diplomatic service and was posted to a consulate in Taiwan. After Taiwan, Margaret and her family lived in Israel, Berlin, and numerous other stops along the way before eventually returning to the United States for her to go to high school. But it was during her time in Israel, around the age of 10, when Margaret began writing her own novels for fun, simply to amuse herself when she ran out of books to read. She went to college at Tufts University, where she double majored in English literature and biology, and then went on to earn a master's in ecology at Stanford University. Next, she combined her interests in literature and science and took a position as a science writer at the National Cancer Institute, where she worked for a number of years. Soon after, Margaret would come up with her initial idea for a novel about Henry VIII. And in 1986, she published her novel, The Autobiography of Henry VIII, 14 years after she had that initial idea. The book became a bestseller and is still in print today, nearly 4 decades later. Most importantly, that novel was just the beginning of her extraordinary and prolific career as a novelist. Over the years, Margaret has become one of the best in the world at her craft and is celebrated by readers and her peers alike. In an email exchange I had with Margaret's fellow New York Times bestselling author and past Everybody Pulls the Tarp guest Stephanie Dre, Stephanie called Margaret the queen of historical fiction. My conversation with Margaret is a rare behind-the-scenes look at how one of the world's most successful novelists performs her craft. It's filled with incredible and powerful stories, as well as ideas that apply far beyond the craft of writing. I will be thinking about this conversation with Margaret for a long time to come, and I hope you take away as much from this one as I have. Oh, and one more thing. This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended to be a substitute for the advice of a physician, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional. So, let's pull the tarp and get straight to Margaret George. Where I want to begin, you have lived in many places. You began traveling at the age of 4 when your father joined the U.S. diplomatic service and was posted to a consulate in Taiwan. I am curious, what do you remember most about your childhood looking back?
Oh, well, that's a tall order. I think, it was very different days then and much smaller. These places were very small. We were in actually Taipei when it was called Silho Formosa. I mean, And there were not very many families there. It was very rural. And I remember some things about like driving out into the country and the rice drying on the fields. And I remember the city and we were in the city or town. But I guess what I remember most is just that I got a lot of what I turned into at these places because I love Asian art and the colors and the themes that they always put a store by. But I think it was Israel that really formed me because that's where I started writing, but also because the ancient world was real there. You know, I mean, you can study about the ancient world when you were there it was. And so all these biblical sites were real and, you know, you could go see them. And then like we studied history I went to an English speaking school and we had a textbook called The House of History that I still have. It started out with the Assyrians. And of course, you go to Egypt, which was the main thing. And I really wanted to go to Egypt. And of course, Israel and Egypt had absolutely no diplomatic relations. They didn't recognize each other. They were still fighting. But I begged my father to figure out a way to get me there. And so he concocted some business at the embassy. Well, we could go, and I can still remember I was 9 years old, and I remember flying over the Nile, and I remember going to the pyramids and all those things. And in fact, in one of my books, the Cleopatra book, there's a photograph of me standing next to one of those statues when I was a little kid. I think those fascination things, they start when you're a kid, and they stayed with me. If I had grown up some other place, maybe not. But to me, history is very real. And that's why I think I've enjoyed writing about it so much, because I believe you can go back there, at least in your mind. So I would say Israel had the most effect on me. Germany, less so. I was older when I moved to Germany when I was 13. I mean, I liked Europe. I enjoyed living in Europe, but I don't think that it was as formative for me as Southern Israel. And, you know, let's face it, it's a very unusual, unique place in the world. And I was 789 when I lived there. Very, very formative years.
You alluded to moments ago a time when you were living in Israel that you began to write. You said just a minute or two ago, that was really when I began to write. Take me back to those circumstances. I also believe that you were a reader at a pretty early age, pretty avid reader, would read a lot of books, you know, anything you can get your hands on. And then you started kind of writing when you kind of ran out of things to read, if I recall hearing that story correctly about you.
That's exactly right. I found that, first of all, you know, there weren't that many English books there, English language books in Israel. You had to order them from the U.S. and they would take forever to come. So I started making up stories for myself, and I would think of them before I went to sleep. And they were supposed to be like a serial, you know, and I'd leave off. Then I'd go to sleep. And then the next night, I couldn't remember where I left off. And I thought, well, if I write it down, then I'll know where I left off. So really, that's why I started it. And I was very committed to it. But also, one odd thing about me is that I've always written about places where I wasn't. And for some reason, I was off on the Wild West, which I never set foot in, ever. But I was reading all these horse books and all these Western things. There was a book called Smokey by Will James, written by a cowboy. And I read that, tried to read that again the other day, and I thought, how in the world did an 8-year-old even read this thing? It was very dense, and it was very, I would think, hard to grasp. So I started writing these horse books. Even though I didn't have a horse, and I wasn't out west, but I did take writing lessons there. It was another nice thing. In Israel, they had horses, and they had those Arab horses. I started out, I wrote long books for a kid, and I wrote on these tablets, these yellow tablets my father would bring home from the embassy. And I wrote, they were obviously very derivative for things I was reading. And I started out, I had written one called Indian Red about a horse. I took the name up of a crayon. I was like trying to think of the name for a horse. But then my masterpiece was going to be Fury, the story of the horse. And it was 150 pages long. I illustrated it with watercolors. And there was a guy named Flint West that was the hero. And that was before there was a Clint Eastwood. But anyway, I got all finished with it. And I had read so many horse books. I knew all the publishers. I knew how they were, who to contact. I knew what the illustrators were. So I showed it to him. I told my father I was finished with it. I wanted to send it to a publisher. And people had asked me, well, how can you encourage your child to write? And I said, well, just don't be that interested. Because he was like, oh, okay, all right. I'll box it up. We'll send it off. And he was like, oh, how wonderful. My child's written a book. No, he just said, okay. And I got the address, out of the information book. And I even said, if they didn't want my illustrations, I knew who I wanted to write, do it in pure scroll. And, I still have it to this day. They returned it to me. And I got a very nice letter note from the editor telling me that of course, naturally they weren't going to publish it, but that I had a budding talent and I should continue to write. And I should also work on my spelling. And, that was so encouraging to a kid because, I got this answer from this editor at what was the name of that one? The one that's no longer in business. Of course, it's been eaten up, but it was a big name publisher in the horse genre. And so, I think that I just kept that with me in my heart. It didn't stop me from writing, although I had big hiatuses in when I wrote. I mean, after I left Israel and didn't ride the horses anymore, the horses disappeared. And I think for a long time I was derivative in what I wrote. So then I got very much off onto Ray Bradbury. And then I wrote kind of, fantasy, science fiction stuff. And then I outgrew that phase. I never tried to send it to anybody. But then I had a long hiatus, and then I got the idea for this kind of action adventure thing set on an island, an uncharted island, which you could still have at that point, off of Porto, Brazil. It had, everything, just exploding volcanoes and everything like that. But I couldn't finish it. I was in college, and I was trying to finish it during one summer, and I didn't get done with it. So I put it away and didn't really think much more about writing for a while. I was too busy. And so Henry came, the first novel that I wrote, which was, there it is, that big
There
one.
it is.
There it is. Autobiography of Henry VIII. I got the idea of it because of going to an exhibit at Hampton Court and seeing not only they had the costumes from Six Wives of Henry VIII, the BBC series. And what really struck me, though, was that we were near the haunted gallery where supposedly his fifth wife was, you can hear ghosts screaming down the gallery. And it just struck me that everybody knew about Anne Boleyn. She was such a household name, but no one really knew about Catherine Howard, who was her cousin, and very much kind of a replay of Anne Boleyn. She looked like her. She was condemned on the same basis of, committing adultery and cuckolding the king. In her case, the charges were true. In Anne's, they probably weren't. But I just wondered about that whole thing. Why it struck me, it was kind of like Vertigo, that movie Vertigo, where the person tries to bring back the dead person. They want it to turn out differently this time. And so did Henry want another Anne Boleyn and had it turn out differently? So that's kind of got me into it was going to be like a psychological study of Henry. But I ended up, I couldn't just do that part. I had to do all of his life or you didn't understand him. So that's why it took me so long. And it turned out to be a book not about her, but just about his perceptions of his wives and his life and everything. And it's very large. Back in those days, there were all these really big books out at the time, Chauvin and Michener and all that. So it wasn't so outstandingly big. But that's kind of how I got there. And then that book was such a success. And then people say, what are you going to do next? But yeah, that's the story.
So that book is released in 1986. You went on to publish 6 New York Times bestsellers in total, and your Cleopatra novel was made into an Emmy-nominated ABC TV miniseries. An Emmy-nominated ABC TV miniseries. I am curious, Margaret, one of the things that I'm fascinated about, in particular about your career and your work, is just the depth of the research and work that you put into writing these novels over the years. So I'm curious, I've heard you say before that you enjoy the research and the writing kind of equally. You enjoy what you're doing in the moment, whether it's the research or the writing, kind of the most. And you have to be very disciplined in moving between the two and making sure that you're hitting your deadlines. I want to start with the research. I mean, take me through a little bit about the research process, your research process. How did you ultimately develop the right research process for you? What are some of the behind the scenes? Paint the scene when Margaret George is doing in-depth research for a novel.
Okay, well, I was very naive about any of it, and my go-to thing was always to go get books. But what I did with Henry is at the time, my husband and I were living in St. Louis, near Washington University, and I contacted a history professor to ask him for a reading list because I really knew there was, what you find in the bookstores on the shelves, they're not necessarily authentic. And so he met with me, and to his credit, he didn't laugh at me. I said, I want to write this book about Henry VIII. He didn't say, aha. And he gave me a reading list, and he said, these are the classics. He said, they're all available in print. You can get copies. He said, if you master these, you will have a really good foundation. Plus, it has bibliography. They all have bibliography, so you can pursue. So that's what I did. I went out and I bought all those books. And I never took library books because you have to return them and you can't mark in them. Well, so if I did find a good library book that I really liked, I'd try to get a copy from used bookstores or used things so that I have my own copies. And you can see the enormous amount of, there's all the Nero books around the floor over there. I have no more bookcase.
I see.
And then the Roman stuff is all there. And then, the Mary Magdalene things are in the whole, but they're there. They're there. And they're never going to go away and nobody can say it's overdue. So then I would read them and I would underline it in pencil because I didn't want to knock up with highlighters or ink. And then I go back after that and I made 4x6 cards of all these pertinent sentences in the thing. And they would be divided by topic, like Henry's youth. So anything about his youth that was important. I put what page of the book it came from. Now I realize this is really old-fashioned.
No, but this is how it gets done.
And also, I think just handwriting it and having the hands-on stuff, it goes more in your brain. So then when I would start, I'd be all finished. I'd be pretty much finished transferring this knowledge from the book into the 4x6 cards, which is much more accessible. And then, but I did always have to, the hard part is figuring out how you're going to tell the story. Is it going to be first person? Is it going to be two narrators? Is it going to be third person? And I believe in linear storytelling, especially with this kind of thing, like a biographical novel. I know people jump around now, but I found that, and I'd also write it from beginning to the end so I could sort of grow with the character. So jumping around would kind of jump the tracks. And I only did that one time, which was when I really got tired of the ambulance. I mean, it's been done so many times and Thomas More and it's all very pivotal. But I was eager to get on to the other poor wives because I thought that was new and different. So I just jumped ahead and I went ahead and started, jumped from Anne, I even jumped over Jane Seymour so I could have, Anna Cleese 4, Catherine Howard 5, Catherine Parr 6, well, the problem was when I got finished, Earl Henry was dead. And I'd been going through all this stuff about him getting old and decrepit and all these horrible things that happened to him. Then I had to go back and make him young again. And it was really hard psychologically to do that because in my mind, poor man was gone. So I said, I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to jump ahead and then try to go back.
Once you get through the research, you try and write a first draft pretty quickly, and then you come back and start to fact check and cross-reference.
Well, what I do is I'm writing, I will put, when I come across a fact that I'm not sure of, I put a parentheses with XXX in it. And then I flag the thing I have to look at, but I don't stop writing to go look something up because that can go down a real rabbit hole. And then later you've got all this time, you've got to go and look up all the XXXs.
I find that just going back to something you said earlier that I'm just thinking about now, you talked about finding other sources in the bibliography. I find that some of my best research and some of the best things I find in terms of work on a particular person I'm researching or subject I'm researching is in the bibliography.
But yeah,
People forget that. They just kind of skip through but you can find some really, really interesting work in the bibliographies. It's a good roadmap for additional research.
well, it's just one of those things that for further reading, and it'll tell you other books you might want to look at, because there's a whole book up there about the Battle of Actium. And it's like, you're not going to read that first, you're going to read the overview of the whole story of Cleopatra before you get into all of the seamanship in the Battle of Actium and what happened. So the latter books are for as you get further into it, I think. They're a real blessing, though, because they have all kinds of juicy things in there.
They sure do. All right, everyone. We'll get back to the conversation momentarily. But first, I want to tell you about my free weekly email newsletter, Tarp Pullers. Each week, I share an uplifting and inspirational tarp pulling story that is sure to brighten your day. And I also highlight some of the most powerful ideas I've learned on my journey talking to 200 and counting of the world's top performers. The newsletter is short, concise, and a reader recently told me this. She said it makes her day every time it hits her inbox. Go to everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter to sign up today. I'm curious, one of the things that you've done a lot throughout your career is making sure that you're visiting places where your characters live and the subjects that you're writing about live. You also visit not just once, you'll visit in different seasons. I mean, again, truly immersing yourself in these places and spaces. When did that become a part of your research, or has it been a part of your methods from the beginning, the Henry VIII novel?
Well, actually, maybe it goes back to my father taking me to Egypt. I was 9.
There you go. That may be.
Yeah, Henry was, you'd think it would be easy because after all, a lot of things are still there. And at hand, it's not difficult like going to some place out in the jungle. But the trouble is it's been either made over or it's a tourist place. Like the Tower of London, you won't get any feel for what the Tower of London was really like. You go there, in the summertime with with all the tour groups and everything. You'd have to go in the evening on twilight in January, which I happen to do because then you get the bleakness and there's not many people around there at that time. I was able to go to the ceremony of the keys once, which was interesting because that's at nighttime when they lock up the gates. And then you really do get the feeling of what it was like. Or some of the places have just disappeared and they have been built over, and you have to find some kind of facsimile of it, something that looks like it, but is some other place that looks like it, because if there's nothing but a parking lot there, you can't picture it. Cleopatra, Alexandria was very hard because, it was a glorious Hellenic city. It was all white, gleaming marble and everything, but there are no Hellenic cities anymore. You can't go to one. And also, it's now a Muslim city, so it has all the cultural things of that. So you have another culture completely on top of it. And so when you go there, you have to kind of learn to blank it out somehow. It is still white. I mean, they color the apartments. A lot of them are white along the shore. And then there are the things that are off limit, like the place where the palace was supposedly in Cleopatra's time was out a military thing. You couldn't go there. You weren't even supposed to take pictures of it from a distance. But I took something with a long lens. But it's a challenge sometimes. And then I guess Hampton Court is probably the best preserved. And thank goodness, I think it was William and Mary that were going to make it over. They were going to knock down what we had left of the Tudor part. And they did manage to update the last part. But if they hadn't gotten sick and died or whatever happened, we wouldn't have that. So Hampton Court is you really kind of feel the spirit there.
One of the things I'm just kind of wondering as we're talking here, and listeners may be as well, is whether it's taking on an ambitious idea to write a novel, whether we're researching something unrelated to a writing project, whatever we're doing. If someone is getting ready to take on this seemingly big, massive project, big, massive topic, how do you make it feel like something that you can actually work through?
Hmm. Well, I think you have to be a little naive and think it's easier than you think. I think you have to think, oh, I'm excited about this. I can do this. And you get very involved in thinking about it. And you try not to think about all the steps of it because there are a lot of steps. But what is it? The first step is taken. You're involved in it. I think having a deadline actually does help because there's a lot of things you have to put aside in order to do this. And so if you didn't really have a deadline and you're just sort of writing for yourself, it would stretch out much longer. I think. I really do. And I don't like and some people say I work really well under pressure. I do much better when I think I have a lot of time. So it's better get started early and so that you can go back and correct things. And, you're not the business about handing in your paper at midnight on things to do this. Doesn't bring it makes me too paralyzed.
Like when you think about all the things that you have to do for you to write one of your novels, which are, again, deeply researched, really detailed work, how do you go about, you start early, but then how do you make sure that you're allocating your time the right way?
Well, I try to divide it in half. Like say you have a contract in 3 years, and if you're lucky, you started doing some research beforehand, but it has to be half and half because if you wait too late and start writing, you're just going to run out of time. You won't be able to do a good job on it. So I usually just take some date halfway in between and say, end of research at this point. No more research.
And you mentioned before, like you try and get that first draft out maybe relatively quickly, and then you'll go back. I mean, just give me an idea. How many more drafts are there for Margaret George to get from kind of that first draft to a novel that gets published?
Not a lot. I try to write the first one like this if it's going to be perfect and be published. I don't write it with the idea of, I'll fix this up later. I'll come back. I'll skip that because I call it skating on thin ice because you want to get to the other side of the lake as fast as you can. And then you have a manuscript to work with. And so therefore I sort of think, well, this doesn't count because, it relaxes me. But I find it's hard for me to see things in a different way. Like I have trouble visualizing furniture in a different place in my house. And the odd as that sounds, where once a picture is hanging on the wall someplace, I can't picture it some other place. So I'm not a naturally gifted revisionist. I've had good editors that are good at that. I have one that was just a genius at cutting stuff, but you didn't notice it was cut, which it takes real genius to do. And it's very hard to cut your own stuff anyway. So I think if you have a good editor, they can really be helpful. And I also show it as I'm going along so I don't get steered, not going on and on with something that's not going in the right direction. Originally, the Mary Queen of Scots book was going to be a dual novel with Elizabeth and Mary. And as I got to a certain point, that editor said, look, you've got to decide. There has to be one major character and one minor character. It's just too confusing. You have two privy councils with 9 people on them. You have this, you got that. You start the Elizabeth 9 years earlier because she's 9 years older. And she said, you've just got to decide which is going to be the main character and the other, a secondary supporting character. And I decided to do Mary Queen of Scots. And I was doing it in the third person too, because you have to know what happens with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth still had a big part, but I'm glad she stopped me before I got much further. And she was right about that,
There's a lot to that sometimes there's a balance between trusting your gut and the flow that you're in, and also making sure you get an outsider's perspective to kind of prevent you from going down a path that, is a path you either don't want to or don't need to go.
Yeah. And another one that happened was that I love frame stories. I do love to have frame stories. And so Cleopatra, to begin with, there was going to be a modern archaeologist, a little boy. See, this is the autobiography, like me. A 9-year-old boy whose father's in the Foreign Service, and they were about to flood the temples with the Aswan Dam. So he's looking at these things from a boat, and then he thinks about Cleopatra and all that stuff. And so I was going to have him discover the scrolls at the end. And my editor said, well, it's very interesting, but is he going to come in the rest of the story? Or is he just going to pop up at the end? And I said, well, I think he's just going to pop up at the end. She said, well, it's so well written, but you have a problem because you don't want, if you have a dual storyline, people usually prefer one over the other. You should be careful that the one that's not Cleopatra is not the one that they really want to act to. You don't want this one to steal her thunder. I think you should just, drop him. So he was probably right because I find that when it's very rare that I don't find dual timelines to be, one of them is much more interesting than the other. And as she said, when you get to the other thing, oh no, I have to read this one again. I have to leave. So I thought it was just safer. She was right about that. So I've never tried that again because it's a very tricky thing to do. I think it's hard to make them equally compelling, especially if they're in different timelines.
Margaret, I could ask you questions all day. This is just so fascinating to dig into how one of the great novelists of our time does her work. I am curious, as we start to kind of wind down our conversation, when you think about kind of where you were as a writer at the beginning of your career as a novelist to where you are today, is there one or two areas that you feel like you grew and evolved the most as a writer from a craft perspective?
Oh, good question. Well, I sort of covered a little bit about those editorial helps. What was the hardest one to write? Well, for one thing, Mary Magdalene was, because how can you make Jesus a fictional character? And that was the first one that I had things that might offend people. I mean, no one's really offended about Henry VIII. I mean, I learned to think about how the character was perceived in the world today and for my readers for the first time, really. And I especially had to do that with Nero because, he has such really, you think Henry's bad. But I was struck with Nero really, truly he never should have been emperor. He really was an artist. He was emperor because so many people were killed to make an emperor. And you didn't resign as an emperor. There was not like Pope Gregory the 16th. You can't just step down and then reside quietly in the Vatican and nobody will bother you because there was only one exit for an emperor. He was not dead. So I think that being aware of your character's place in history, I grew in that. Also, I think in telling about mythological people like Helen of Troy, who really, I was so disappointed to learn never really lived. And in fact, none of the characters in the Iliad, we have no proof, no historical proof that they ever lived, which seems impossible because we know there was a Trojan War and we know they were written about and they seem so real. And so I had also I asked because the thing when I started writing it was, well, just tell the story about the gods and just people. Well, I asked a classicist about this and I said, what do you think about that? And he said, the trouble is the gods are the action. They fuel the action. They fuel the characters. And if you take away the gods, you take away the motivation of the character. In other words, Paris wasn't being rewarded for the beauty contest on Helen. He was just the guy who got sent over on a diplomatic mission to Mycenae or Sparta. And said, without the motivation, we got to invent other motivation, which won't be as compelling. It won't be as gripping. So I decided, yeah, he's right. The gods are going to be real. And I really enjoyed that because I think they do make a story much more vivid. The ancients knew what they were doing when they wrote it. Homer did. But I just think, too, I'm probably more aware of my surroundings, my audience, what is going to be controversial. Mary Magdalene actually came out before the Dan Brown movie. And because of the Dan Brown movie, a lot of people bought my book. I guess they thought it was another version, but it was so different. So, that whole, and then for a while, there were just zillions of Mary Magdalene books. So you have to think about where is the interest today? Where is the concern today? I mean, now there was a lot of Cleopatra stuff at one time, and she made it coming back, but things go in cycles. So don't start something that is in the middle of a cycle, because by the time you get it finished, nobody will be interested anymore.
Right. Right.
It runs its course, and then the people had enough of filling the blank.
I'm curious, Margaret, when you think about just your career, is there one thing that you can kind of point to and say, it's because I did this, or because I had this skill set or this attribute about me that you think played just an outsized role in your success?
Oh, my. You mean something I did or something
A
about?
skill that you have, or something, or one thing that you did, or is there, or one or two examples of things that you say, you know what, that played a huge role in the arc of my career?
Well, first of all, there's always this huge element of luck. And the fact that I met my agent kind of casually, I'll try to make it short because I know but I had written the Desert Island Exploding Volcano book. And I did finish it because I had taken one of those night courses. And the teacher said, he said, the things that you've done well, you've probably always done well, and things you do badly, you've always done badly. So pick something you haven't seen in ages and ages and you don't care about it anymore, and just look at it, analyze it. So I got this book down and I thought, oh, I bet this is just really terrible. And so instead I thought, oh, this is just great. I have to finish it. It's so funny because, you're supposed to learn from it. But instead I got all hyped up about the story again and I finished it. And I was so excited about it. And I had a friend who had a friend by an agent. You know how that is. And I sent it to him and he said, oh, I think this is really good. I'll take it to my agent. And if you don't mind, and have him take a look at it. And so I then got a letter from the agent and said, I have your book. I'll be reading it. And I was so excited. It was around Thanksgiving and we were going to be going back east to visit my family and my in-laws. And I had to get a blow by blow description of everywhere I would be every minute in case he was going to get in touch with me. It was like, and telephone numbers and all this stuff. Well, I was at my in-laws and it was right around New Year's. And I get this phone call and my father-in-law comes out and says, there's somebody here calling for you. And it was the agent. He lives in Connecticut and quite near out of New York. He said, I have read your book, Miss George. And then there's this pause and he said, all of it, because, they always just read the first. And then there was this long pause. He said, well, I'm afraid it's not for me. And then he said, and that person said, oh, terrible. He said, however, I was ready to pack it up and send it back to you in Wisconsin. If you want to come and pick it up, we can talk about the book. And I thought, yeah, okay. Of course, I'm going to convince him how wonderful this is. Because I was really and so naive and so unpracticed in anything. So then we ran into another roadblock as my father-in-law, who was very stingy, said, he's just trying to save the postage. You're not going to take my car and drive all the way out there. And my husband said, well, we've got to get out there. And if you don't let us, then we're just going to rent a car. So anyway, he gave us the car. We got out there. It was New Year's Day. We talked and he told me, first of all, my hero was so unlikable. He was glad when the anaconda got in. Then he asked the question, which I was so naive I didn't expect, but I know now that this people have this. He said, well, have you done anything else? And I said, well, I started this book about Henry VIII, but I laid it aside partly because I was too young to write it because I didn't know anybody who even died. So how could I write a book about Henry? And I told him that, and I said, well, it's just not finished. He said, well, it doesn't have to be finished. I said, doesn't have to be finished? He said, no. He said, I know you can write a book all the way to the end and conclude it and follow through. And he said, a lot of people start out very well in the first good 3 chapters, but they can't carry a book all the way through. He said, no, now tell me about it. I think this would be interesting. So that's how I got a second chance, because had I not driven out there, had I not been in New York, I had not met him, and what would have happened? The thing would have landed on my doorstep all. So that's one thing. But the other thing you said, I think I had a strange combination of kind of an anal compulsive dedication to research and fact and a slowing adolescent imagination. They don't usually go together. I mean, they're usually people that are very good at research and very good at facts, but they don't have that imagination. And the imagination people may not want to do all the research. That's all I can come up with.
Very well said. And just that story about how you responded to that call from the agent, I think it's such a profound story because you described it as a little bit of luck, but I always like to say you can create your own luck.
Yeah.
You created your own luck by following through and taking him up on that opportunity to meet and driving the car out there and convincing your father-in-law to give you the car. And it led somewhere incredible. And I think there are so many examples of that. And I think that's regardless of what it is that we're pursuing, we're working on, when we're met with a little bit of resistance, if we find a way to just take another step forward, it may unlock a lot of opportunity for us. Margaret, this has been so much fun. I have really, really enjoyed learning about how you do your work. This has been very, very fascinating. I'm so grateful for the time we've gotten to spend together.
Thank you. No, I have really enjoyed it. I'm sure we could have gone much longer. And I could have shown you my little 4x6 cards and everything. I should have had them out. But yeah, I really have enjoyed it. It's fun to go down memory lane and think about where you came from and how you ended up here. Because you have Henry be 40 years next.
Yes, 1986. And that was published.
Yeah, I mean, it's still in print and it's still selling and it's still no one else has done another one like that. You know, you'd think that somebody else would have done a whole Henry story, but they haven't. Lots of Anne Boleyn stories, though.
Yes. Well, a 6-time New York Times bestseller, Margaret George. There is no question in my mind, as I like to say every week on this podcast, we talk about the everybody pulls the tarp mindset. You are a certified tarp puller.
Oh, I really? Oh.
You do the nitty gritty, the details. There's no task beneath you when it comes to doing your work the right way. Certified tarp puller, always a member of the Everybody Pulls the Tarp family, Margaret.
Thank you. I'm honored to be inducted into this company.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for spending some time with me this week. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you. Okay, I hope so.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Instagram at AndrewMoses123 and sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Until next time, keep pulling the tarp.